Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Stone to Tulane as part of the Mellon Lecture Series. And the theme of this year's series is what I've called Putting Lives on Paper. And that's a broad topic, of course. It includes the biography, autobiography, memoir, journalistic profiles, and of course, the novel. And Robert Stone is well qualified to discuss this subject since he's spent much of his own life putting lives on paper. As one of America's preeminent and most prolific post-war novelists, he's managed to create, imagine, and adapt or fictionalize characters who leap off the page and confront us with the demons and complexities of our own humanity. His best-selling novels include Hall of Mirrors, a classic based in New Orleans, Dog Soldiers, winner of the National Book Award based on his experience as a correspondent in Vietnam. Also, A Flag for Sunrise, Children of Light, Outer Bridge Reach, Damascus Gate, and Bay of Souls. His short story collection, Bear and His Daughter, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. More recently, he has moved into literary nonfiction with a superb memoir, Prime Green, Remembering the Sixties. Our guest is no stranger to the academic world, having taught creative writing for some 30 years at such prestigious schools as Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, University of California at San Diego. And we are fortunate that he's agreed to add Tulane to that list, if only for a day. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Stone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming this afternoon. You know, it is special for me to be in this city, you know, where I lived here for a while. It was, you know, not terribly long, but it was more than a year, and time was longer in those days. So it's really good to be back, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Will. Well, let's start by talking about the memoir, Prime Green. What was your goal in writing that? Was it to tell your own story or paint the picture of a colorful era, or perhaps both?
I think it was both. I mean, finally it was both. And it was something that I had been asked to do. The extension of really a very short piece I did in Architectural Digest about the years when I was a schoolboy, when I was growing up in New York. And but what it seemed to me that I wanted to write before I got into that sort of awful childhood parent complex, was something about the time that you know, I was a young adult, which was, you know, I mean, a time, as they say, like any other, but it was a lot of fun. It was an interesting time, and you know, I had a perspective that I thought was worth recording. So I did that volume first, and I now realize that now that I'm more at home in the memoir, I could deal with all that sort of formative stuff, you know, if the world was interested. But I thought I'd start with remembering the 60s, because that was actually what people seemed to enjoy, and I have to say it was relatively easy to write, because it was, you know, it was a time when, you know, when I was sort of being young and crazy and enjoying myself. So you're always attached to the period when you were young, and so I decided to do that. And so it was both. It was recording the time and also establishing my perspective of that time.
You know, Bob, about 10 years ago in Salon magazine, you told an interviewer something that I found interesting. This is a quote. You said, "You never want facts to get in the way of truth, and that's why fiction is more satisfying than nonfiction." And now that you've done a work of nonfiction in the first person, in the form of your recent memoir, have you changed your thinking on that at all, fiction versus nonfiction?
Well, philosophically, I haven't. But I mean, it is necessary, you know. I mean, it's always tempting, I think, for any writer to, you know, to embellish. I mean, it's a natural storyteller's instinct. However, you cannot do this in today's world. I mean, years ago, and I write about this a little bit in the memoir, I was one of the people, in case you ever wondered who these people are, who wrote a supermarket tabloid. That was my apprenticeship. Well, it wasn't. I mean, I'm speaking facetiously. It was not an apprenticeship in anything. It was it was something that I did so that myself and my family could eat. But I mean, I can't tell you how vulgar and violent and inconsequential these pieces were. The only thing that could be said for them in a positive light was that they weren't true. The pieces that we made up. I mean, I would be embarrassed to quote from some of them. Well, one of them actually that the New Yorker, when they excerpted a piece of this memoir, actually ran. Sorry about this. It was called "Mad Dentist Yanks Girl's Tongue." Now I have to explain this. We had a picture that we were going to run in the tabloid, and somebody spilled ink on it. Three of us did this. We put this tabloid out, and the ink we were going to use we had a picture of a starlet, a vampire, a starlet lady vampire who was having a stake driven through her heart, and the picture we were going to use was sort of a headshot of her and her face, but somebody spilled ink on her. We're trying to ink out her fangs, and we spilled the ink. So we had this picture of a starlet with a mouthful of slop. And, you know, what can we do with this? Deadline is coming up. So, wham, you know, suddenly this absurd and perverse instinct occurred to us, so we used that. And the point being, in terms of not being able to make things up in memoirs, the New Yorker, which did an excerpt from this, went online, and they somehow located this dreadful story somewhere out there in the ether. There it was. I mean, if I'd made that up and said it was in the National Mirror, when it was in the National Mirror, I would have been nailed as a poseur, as a James Free, as a Miss Metzger. So, I mean, the circumstances, I think, just precluded my attempts to any attempts I might have made to draw the long bow. So, I mean, as far as facts getting in the way of truth, I do believe that philosophically. I think this is the temptation that journalists have sometimes to alter, to attempt to get by, what has happened, what has literally happened in the order it happened, in order to get at the true story. And this is a bad thing to do, but it's an obvious temptation.
Yeah. Well, apart from this question of truth and how far you go in embellishing it, what is more satisfying to you as a writer? To write, to invent characters, invent dialogue, create situations, let your imagination really go wild without limits, or to try to do what you've just done in Prime Green, which was really distill a period of your life, a period of American cultural history, really, a different kind of writing. But which do you find ultimately more satisfying?
I think fiction, which has always seemed to me in a way harder. Well, that's not true. Harder is not the right word. But more challenging in certain respects. I mean, there's something wonderful about letting a story begin and following it to where it goes and making it happen and spending the day with it and ending up in a different place altogether from where you were when you started out that day. I mean, there's something special about that. Remembering and trying to breathe life and words into memory is also, really interesting and worthwhile. But there's something, I don't know, there is for me, and I think this is just entirely for me, a mystical level for fiction. And The question of fiction and nonfiction is really very interesting. I can't go into some of the details I'd like to go into about my experience in reading and talking about fiction and nonfiction. But fiction is first for me. Although I would like to do a more complex memoir than this one. This one is full of things that are funny, and I like recounting them because they're funny. At least in retrospect, they're funny. But fiction is, I guess, my first love.
Well, Bob, one thing that's funny, there are a lot of things that are funny in Prime Green. One passage I remember that was funny, but also very determining in the direction your life took was this strange temptation you had while you were living in New Orleans to go off and join this traveling passion play, and which would have caused you to take a very different turn in your life. Could you read that passage for us? I
will read that passage. I have to say this is I hadn't been reading this because it was a little bit more personal than this memoir is for the most part is. But I have everybody's permission to who's concerned in this to read it. So I will read it. This was. I hate to say this. This must have been 1960. And we were living in the quarter on 612 St. Philip Street. And I had been selling encyclopedias up in Pearl River County, Mississippi, and St. Tammany Parish, and I had been arrested, and I got tired of doing that. So a couple of weeks after I was liberated from my Mississippi imprisonment, I saw a strange sign on the wall of a Royal Street coffee shop. It was printed in a kind of liturgical script with a cross and what looked like upraised spears. The largest drawn figure was of a metal chalice, and the title was the reproduction of the production was The Cup. There was what appeared to be a photograph of Jesus Christ in the middle of the sign. Closer inspection revealed it to be the photo of an actor in costume, a melancholy, long-faced man with an actorish name, who, according to the sign, portrayed the Christus. The sign was soliciting apprenticed actors for the roles in a traveling passion play, which the sign said was North America's most reverent and moving commemoration of our Lord's sacrifice. It seemed to move from town to town, sponsored by local churches. I wrote the telephone number down along with the particulars of the next few performances. I didn't know what was on my mind. At 75 cents and $1.50, the tickets were in excess of our entertainment budget. At that time, we were surviving through our discovery of an old New Orleans amenity, the friendly beanery waitress. The friendly beanery waitress could slip you a slice of white bread and red-eye gravy to keep you whole until the next opportunity came to borrow a quarter. Public assistance was not available. I mentioned the odd joint to Janice, who politely told me she didn't think she'd like to go. Then I called the number of the operation and pretended to be an applicant for a role in the reverent commemoration. Anyway, I thought of myself as pretending. The show's local operation was in a small suite of rooms at a shabby, barely respectable hotel on Carondelet Street. The hall door was opened by a tall, slender woman with long, silky hair. She had the unsound blue eyes of an Ibsen leading lady, magnified by wire-framed glasses. Gorgeous was the word for her. Hers had been the voice that responded to my telephone call. I later learned that she was one of the Christus's two lovely daughters. In fact, I never got to see the other one, but of her comeliness I have no doubt. The sisters used various clerical and organizational duties with a group. They also performed on stage bits like Pilate's wife and the serving girl who denounces Peter. The man himself, the Christus, was pale and fine-featured with a high forehead and a bald dome. The fringe around his skull made him look tonsured. He wore very darkly colored aviator glasses and a black lightweight suit. His voice was cultivated and inevitably somewhat affected. His name, as I had noticed, was unlikely and resonant. All at once, I recognized it as the name of a radio actor on one or another of the radio dramas I'd listened to. Latitude, he told me, is the key. People feel as though they're at a church service. They're open and worshipful, sensitive. They may not identify a bad attitude, but they are aware of it. Something will trouble them. I nodded thoughtfully. Was attitude catching up with me again? As a youth, I was as innocently bad-attituded as I could get away with. You cannot disdain the story. You cannot disdain your character. Of course, you can't despise the audience. The audience, he told me, would consist of small-town folks all over North America. And the outfit was called the International Gospel Theater, with an R-E. It worked its way like a wheat harvesting combine rolling up from the Texas plains to the edge of the muskeg in northern Manitoba. The character I would compete to portray was the chief temple guard, although I would have to learn several parts. As chief temple guard, I would command a corps of teenage Bible students, always locally recruited, who would serve as Herodian spear carriers. It was also the guard's responsibility to put up and break the sets under the supervision of their chief. The audiences, the Christus informed me, were unlikely to have seen a live show before unless it was a previous performance by the International Gospel Theater. He said his group had been offered good money to perform on tape, but the Christus believed in live performance. It was the only way to bring out the sacramental quality of a passion play. Did I grasp this? I said I did, but he told me anyway. About the 30 Years' War and the plague and the burghers of Aberamagau, I had always mixed up the town with the half-timbered village that hired the Pied Piper. He had me do some readings from the King James Bible, Job, and Ecclesiastes, Revelation. I asked him if I would have to read such stuff on the road. He said he liked my readings. He said from time to time we would open the show with a little scripture. I saw the comely daughter who took phone calls looking at me. She had listened to me wailing on the 7 seals and the beast from the sea, and so on. The Christus noticed me returning her look. You have folks, he asked, married? No, I heard myself say, not me. Yeah, well, he said, it's no spot for a family man. The last thing I could endure to be at that moment was a family man. The Christus said he thought well of my work and might decide to hire me. He had a few other men to hear. For some, it was a courtesy. They were past it. So you want to play the chief of temple guards, he said. He had the kind of smile called vulpine. In his pictures with a Jesus wig, he looked like Rasputin. He told me to check back in person at the end of the day. I thought of going home to the quarter, but I didn't want to see Jay. I was contemplating an unspeakable treachery, or at least I thought I was. I went to the public library on Federal Square where it was cool and read the city histories. There was an entire room filled with genealogy. I settled down in fiction and read all of The Plumed Serpent. I admired Lawrence very much then. From time to time, the bottom fell out under my stomach when I remembered what I was contemplating, and I said, oh God, which was enough to turn the other readers in my direction. When the time came, by my cigarette coupon watch, I replaced the book and went into the glaring heat of downtown. On Magazine Street, the Christus's lovely daughter smiled without looking at me as she let me pass. Well, Mr. Christus said solemnly, you may join us if you choose. For a second, I didn't get it. When I understood, I said, can I bring something along? Someone along? You certainly can't. Ah, I said, when will we be back here? I wouldn't think for the best part of a year, if we get any gigs in this state at all. Problem? I shook my head, feeling ever fainter. No problem. Can you come with us to Lake Chickasaw, he asked. We're there tomorrow night. Can you make it, he said when I didn't answer. We'll book you a room in this hotel tonight. You won't even have to share this time. We'll buy you dinner, his young daughter said, if you can get back here. Sure, I said. I felt as though I must be trembling. The thought of their dinner made me ill. I wanted the crazy life I was looking at more than anything. The last trace of gypsy life on the continent. I did not want to be stuck in New Orleans with my pregnant wife. All at once it seemed to me that the chance at theater I had opted away from in New York had spun around my way in these absurd trappings, in a mode for which provincial would be too pretentious a term. I wanted feverishly to clamber aboard this absurdity, and I wanted the ruthlessness and sang-froid to try. I don't know what I saw shining there. Maybe just the chance to change the life I was making for myself and start a new one. Anyway, my theatrical fantasy was back shimmering, available if I could find the resources to go for it. I walked back down through the hot streets, across Canal and down Royal to St. Philip, through the patio and up the inner stairs. Janice was on the balcony, leaning back on her chair, resting her feet. Naturally slim, she was showing 7 months pregnancy. She looked radiant and lovely, a loose lock of brown hair over her eye. "Where have you been?" she asked me. "The library, and pursuing this phantom job." I wanted a drink. I took a few dollars, which I could ill afford, from our pathetic money stash and went down to the corner saloon. I had a couple of twofers at the bar and took a jug of plonk home with me. "What was the phantom job?" she asked. I was sitting a couple of feet away from her, looking down toward the river. I was thinking of towns like Lake Chickasaw, of the whole continent disappearing into times past. There was no chance that an experience like performing in The Cup would ever come my way again. I was too young to be tied down in this way. A world of adventures awaited across continents and across oceans, a world of beautiful and available women, of which the Christus's daughter, who indeed seemed to like me, was only the first. I looked over at Janice and I thought, she's done it to herself, committed to this all too young. She was just a kid, committed to a louse like me. She'll find out what a selfish creep I am. She can pass the baby to her parents. They could help her. She could have a life, and in turn I could have a life, and cross those continents and oceans to where life was richer, to embrace fate, to live out the cruel rituals of life at the core, at the flame, to do and to see everything, oh wow, and to have the courage to be brutal and to reject convention and compromise. Chief Temple Guard was only the beginning. I snuck another look at her, and indeed she looked beautiful. And being so young, she looked innocent and trusting. She looked as though she loved me. So, at that moment, I knew that I was not going anywhere. I loved her, and that was fate. If I stood up to leave, my legs would fail, my frame wither, my step stumble forever. All my strength was subsumed by this rash, so unwise, too early love. There was no hope except in this woman. She would give birth, and the new life would assert itself and take over our center and prepare to replace us. Instead of far continents, it was boring parenthood. We would just roll down the old biology road like every other sucker, trapped by nature's illusion like a bug by a predator's coloration. I felt infinitely relieved, happy for a moment, as I would hardly ever be. I thought, this rejoicing shows my mediocrity. Just another Daddy Dagwood bourgeois jerk. Because if I had been Destiny's man, I thought, I would have walked, strided away with my bus schedule and my backpack, ready to ride from Chickasaw Lake to the Great Slave. But I was not. I could not any more than I could fly. I guess I also knew at about that moment that I would never leave her, not ever, that this thing was forever. Your great soul, your world historical figure, would have walked. Not Bob. Not your daddy children. Leave your mother? No. So, like the original Christus and the rich young man who could not leave the life he knew, I turned my back on the wager and went my way. Okay.
You know, Bob, that passage echoes a passage you wrote fictionally 40 years earlier in The Hall of Mirrors. There's a character who's not the protagonist, but he's a very eccentric, colorful character who has made a career of going around with this traveling passion play, and he was a charlatan of many sorts. I found it most interesting, having read the fictional version of it, to then encounter what was the initial experience that had kind of given birth to that fictional use of it. And I guess that raises the question, really, of to what extent you use your own experience, your own first-person experience or your own observations, use it, adapt it, as an inspiration or a source of material for your fiction.
Some people, I think, work more autobiographically than others do. I never did life portraits. Now this character is really, I mean, it takes off from this man. I better specify with the life running into reality the way I do, that I turned this character into a truly villainous, awful person.
What's his name in Hall of Mirrors? I forgot.
Oh, what's his name? What do I call? Oh, I call it Farley the Sailor. Okay,
right.
thank you. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, yes. So any relation between the character that I actually talked to 50 years ago and the character Farley the Sailor is coincidental, absolutely. I have to emphasize that very strongly. But everything in fiction, I think inevitably is something that you've experienced, or something that someone else has experienced, or something you've read about somewhere. I really like invention. I like you can hang a character on a gesture, really, on an overheard laughter, on somebody glimpsed briefly who stays with you, in a crowd, and who you have never seen before, never see again, and you can imagine life into that person, as opposed to doing what a number of writers have done, which is really to take their experience and their friends and fictionalize it. That's something I've never done. And actually the relationship of Farley the Sailor to that experience of mine in the past is unusually congruent. So I don't do life portraits, and I don't do autobiographical things, but I certainly have always used things that have happened to me, that I've seen or heard of. It's all true, I guess, about somebody somehow at some time, but not in a direct memoirish way.
Well, let's talk about some real life characters that you dealt with and portrayed very vividly in Prime Green. You had the good fortune, or maybe the bad fortune, to encounter some legendary and in some cases notorious figures of the 50s and 60s, and to write about them in Prime Green. People like Jack Kerouac, Ken Kesey, Neal Cassady, to name a few. Which one of them impressed you the most?
Well, Kesey was a friend of mine. Ken Kesey was really a close friend of mine, and I knew him well. I knew him a long time. He and Faye, his wife, were, and Janice and I, the woman in that book, and the woman I'm still married to, were the people who had been married longest of anybody we knew. I mean, we had been married, forever. So we were both, young when we ran into each other. Kesey had already written 2 books, and so I knew Kesey well. Kerouac was older than I was. He was a famous writer, and when we lived in New York, my wife, who worked as a guidette in the RCA building, and when she finished her shift showing sort of tourists around the RCA building, she climbed into her beatnik clothes and was a waitress at the Seven Arts Cafe, where Kerouac would read. So in a lot of the pictures taken of Kerouac reading, the very famous picture of him against the microphone, she's just out of the picture, sort of carrying espresso around. Kerouac, when I got to know him better, and I never really got to know him very well, he was ruined. He was ruined, I guess, principally by alcohol. He had acquired the idea that of being a conservative, I guess, at that point, but I wouldn't call, what he had come to profess to believe conservative. He had become very anti-Semitic and racist, and affected to be an admirer of Bill Buckley. Buckley actually threw him off his show, threw Kerouac off his show for being drunk and abusive. He was drunk and abusive, and it was alcohol that did him in. And he was also an intensely sentimental man. On the Road is an intensely sentimental book, without irony, without humor. I'm not a great admirer of it. And his sentimentality, as it will in certain people, just reversed itself into anger. It took, and the alcohol didn't help. He was an angry, bitter person when I got to know him a little better, and he certainly had no use for me, or for anybody much at all at that point in his life. He also had been ridiculed. People don't realize how much ridicule the Beats were subjected to. Kerouac had written this, I guess, in imitation of Thomas Wolfe. He'd written On the Road on a long roll of teletype paper, as we used to call it. And Truman Capote famously said, well, Kerouac and those people, they're not writers, they're typists. And this kind of quotation was always being visited on Kerouac and on Ginsberg and on all those people. They really were lambasted by what we used to call the mainstream press, and I guess he was embittered by that. He never felt he got the appreciation he should have got. He went on writing, on amphetamines, on alcohol. For all his sins, whatever his sins may have been, he certainly suffered. I mean, he was a kind of, he was not a victim of alcoholism. Cassidy was also a drug casualty. I mean, Neal Cassidy, who is, I should say, the Dean Moriarty character in On the Road.
So he's a close buddy of Kerouac's.
Yeah, he was a close buddy of Kerouac's and of Allen Ginsberg. And I think with that whole, sort of Kerouac, Ginsberg, Cassidy thing, there was a kind of homoerotic element, which was no business of mine. So I didn't know those people on that level, or in that area. But I think that was kind of going on. Ginsberg and Kerouac both sort of worshipped Cassidy, who was, it's hard to describe him. He always suggested Popeye the Sailor to me, sort of chesty little guy who had this sort of 40s hipster manner, which are commemorated by Marlon Brando in The Wild One. If you remember the kind of character and persona that's being invoked by the Marlon Brando character, that's kind of what Cassidy was like. He went back to On the Road is really about 1950. He was published in 57, but it's really about your kind of 49, 50s America, before interstates, before restaurant chains, before all that, as a wonderful magical invocation of the wildness and freedom of the country. But it doesn't have a lot else, and has a lot of bad writing in it. Cassidy, unfortunately, was an amphetamine addict, and he was really gone by the time I saw him on and off. He never ate, and he never slept, and he never shut up, because he was on amphetamines all the time. And I tell this story in Tom Green. He had a parrot named Rubiaco. And everywhere, this was when we were all hiding out in Mexico, and the cops were after Kesey for various crimes and misdemeanors. So Cassidy had his parrot, Rubiaco, which he carried everywhere. And since he never shut up for a minute, the parrot very soon began to sound a lot like Neal Cassidy. Parrots being the creatures they are. And you'd walk into a room and you could never say, somebody would say something like, the last time I was in Denver, man. And you could never be sure whether it was Cassidy or the parrot. I mean, since Cassidy was unrelenting. I really, I was not an admirer of Neal Cassidy.
But didn't the parrot outlive him?
Yes, the kicker of that story is years later, my wife and I are up at Kesey's. We're sleeping in the barn, and I hear this voice say, Cassidy now has been dead for 30 years at this point, and this voice says, the last time I was in Denver, man. It's the parrot. Parrots live like 200 years or something. So there is all that is left in the universe of Neal Cassidy, is sort of behind the demented eyes of this bird.
Bob, for somebody who was a minor figure in American literary history, Neal Cassidy, did he ever actually do anything?
Well, he shot a lot of methadone. I mean,
Well, I guess
he turned up at Kesey's one time. Kesey, he drove this bus, this where is it? That celebrated bus on the cover of the paperback. And that was one of his claims to fame. He ended up he probably ruined himself as being a character in other people's fiction. I mean, various people have used him as characters in one way or another, and I used him in this sort of ridiculous short story I wrote years ago called "Por qué no tiene, por qué le falta." No, he never particularly did anything except manifest himself as as the spirit of America to a few poets and writers.
Yeah. Well, of that triumvirate that we've just been talking about, I guess Kesey was the one of
Kesey was a
substance,
friend of
real
mine. Yeah,
literary
I mean, Kerouac and Cassidy were not friends of mine, nor were they people I particularly saw the point of.
Yeah.
I mean, but I guess my clique, me and my clique. I mean, we were as bad as they were. We were just a different, sort of younger, oncoming generation. Or
Well, it's partly a generational thing too, isn't it? I mean, you kind of bridge this transition between the beat movement in the 50s and I guess you could call the psychedelic excesses of the 60s.
Yeah.
How would you, to the extent that you observed and participated in them, particularly the latter, how would you compare these two movements, if you can call them that, these two periods?
Well, the 50s were in their way. I mean, I spent a lot of the 50s in the Navy. I mean, so I didn't have access to it for a lot of for many years. But 58, 59 were very interesting years. This gray conformity that you hear about was really not so pervasive and uniform. There was a reaction against it. Something really had to be done about various aspects of social pathology that were still left over. I mean, somebody had to react against that kind of complacent materialism. I mean, anybody who would have found themselves young in that era would have done the same thing. It had to be done. It was something that was required. But it was conditioned also by the tremendous prosperity of America at that time. The country was richer and more powerful than it had ever been. People who remember the Depression, who'd grown up in the Depression and been in the Second World War, really, as we didn't understand, were holding the lid on. They had never had it so good. They had seen terrible things. They had worked terrible jobs for terrible wages. They had died on the beaches of Normandy. We didn't know that. We didn't understand it. If we knew it, we didn't get it. And something had to be done about that complacency, so we reacted to it. We almost automatically reacted to it. I give more credit for people like Cassidy and Kerouac, than I would for what came later. The beats, and I was really just there I am. I'm in this cafe. My wife is the waitress there. I'm hanging out. I look at Ginsberg and Kerouac when they come in, and trailed by Cassidy. These are famous people already, and I'm really just a kid on the fringe. So I didn't feel like I was really part of that scene, except somebody's got to buy the coffee. Somebody's got to be in the audience to watch hear the poet read the jazz. And what happened later was that this aesthetic became a mass phenomenon. The Beats, and I suppose we in California in the early '62, in the early '60s, we were kind of snobbish and elitist. We thought we were really hot stuff, and there was hardly anybody like us. And the closest thing to us was the French symbolists. I mean, when we did those psychedelics, that's really what we were thinking of. Is what I was thinking of. I mean, I wasn't trying to get with it. I was trying to be Mayame or Baudelaire. When it became a mass phenomenon, and the bohemian style was adopted by every single loose kid in America who turned up in San Francisco in 1967, it wasn't so much fun anymore. And it became really intensely druggy. It became kind of about drugs, which was, had not been the idea, really. Although that became a separating point, who smoked marijuana, who didn't. It became much more significant than we ever would have thought it would be. But that and the music, which I don't write much about in this book, which I ought to have paid more attention to, became the defining elements. Really, it was, as Phil Oakes' song said, it was a small circle of friends. That's what I enjoyed. And when it became a mass phenomenon, and that style was everywhere, and university was a lot less fun. And of course, that was also the era, and I've always remembered this. I referred to it when we were talking earlier. There was the time when people stopped asking each other about their children because they were afraid of what they might hear. I mean, all those drugs, the payoff on all those drugs, it became a very frightening time to be a parent. And, I mean, I know because my punishment was I was a parent at that time, too. I mean, finally. And, I think, knock on wood, my kids were fine, but not everybody's were. And there was a terrible price to pay in a way in the 60s. At the same time, that was a necessary era. Because, again, it's an extension of that reaction to the enormous prosperity of the time and the materialism based on it. We didn't have the perspective of the older generation of the war and the Depression. We were perfectionistic because of the wealth the country enjoyed. We wanted everything. We wanted it perfect, and we wanted it by 6 o'clock tonight, so we could have the party. We were unreasonable. At the same time, what did happen in the 60s that was worth it were those elements of social pathology, racial segregation, extreme sexism, all that had to be put aside. Something had to be done about it, as I said.
Not to mention the war, Bob.
And the war in Vietnam, I mean, which of course was it became, it was a cloud no larger than a man's hand at the start of the 60s, and it became more and more and more a definitive thing. And, across the generational divide, we really could not find a consensus. I mean, the majority of people, in spite of Johnson's not choosing to run again, the majority of people still at least claimed to support the war, even by the time it had been settled. There was a lot of lying, and it was you got very scandalized. I think very, very shocked. People didn't realize how much the leadership of any country tends to say the opposite of what's true. I think actually their problem, the problem of the earlier administrations in situations like Vietnam, was they didn't realize that what you're supposed to do is say the exact opposite of the truth. They tried to shade it, unlike the people presently who just say absolutely 180 degrees the opposite of what's happening, which was the public relations trick, which these guys have now, which in the older generation did not have, the older generation of leadership. So the war had to be combated. It was really based on, in a way, it was more excusable, and I say excusable than the present one, because the country was drawn into it by degrees and trying to apply old lessons of Munich and so forth to inappropriate situation. I can forgive the people who are responsible for that, even though they did far more harm. I find it possible to forgive them. But that overcoming the social pathology, ending the war, that was the upside, and we have some of the benefit of that today.
And there was some damn good music that came out.
And very good music, yeah. I mean, there were musical outfits that didn't make it out of there that I thought were wonderful. There were, of course, the Grateful Dead, who, when I first knew them, were students at the San Francisco Conservatory. Most of them, they wouldn't have anything to do with us because they thought we were too druggy and weird.
Didn't they wear suits?
They wore suits. They had to wear suits to the San Francisco Conservatory, and they would go get the train to the Palo Alto station, and they would just kind of step over our prone bodies. And,
well, Bob, let's talk a little bit about New Orleans. You lived here, I guess, in the very early 60s for a year or so. You based your first novel, Hall of Mirrors, on that experience. Now, I know you had an extensive tour of the city yesterday, including the lower Ninth Ward and a number of other hard-hit areas. Just wonder what are your thoughts on New Orleans then and now, based on your the 3 days you've spent here now on a kind of rediscovery tour?
The first time I came back, which was a long time ago, I guess back in the 70s, merely my knees went weak when I saw this town again. I mean, because of what had happened here and how I connected with it, how I'd written about it, it just hit me like a wave of emotion. Coming back now, I mean, what I remember, what it reminds me of in driving around the Ninth Ward and other parts of town was the incredible poverty that my wife and I, both of us, we took this 1960 census here. I should mention, which was an incredible experience for an aspiring writer. I mean, we were knocking at every door, and I really finally I got the message, which was, this is the strangest city I have ever been in. I mean, I don't know what's going to be behind any door. If I saw choirs of archangels there, it wouldn't surprise me. There can be anything behind the door.
What part of town were you doing that, the census taking in?
The part of town where the Superdome is now, which was then just incredibly poor. And the Illinois Central Railroad yards, where a lot of people lived, we were told that nobody resides there. The Illinois Central Railroad told us. But the Census Bureau sent us in nonetheless to find people, and we found thousands and thousands of people living in what resembled a South American shantytown in there. I have a couple of references to what I ran across on the census then, and the poverty and the it was a mixture of to really get very impressionistic about it, of terrible poverty and people carrying on in spite of it, and a sweetness, a charm of a kind, in the not of the Tea Party sort, but of the magical sort, and a great sort of resignation, and yet and determination. I mean, these words fall very far short of what I'm trying to say. I mean, it's hard to express it. I tried to get it in the memoir how I felt before Katrina. I did a reading, a benefit reading in New York after Katrina, and somebody read a poem by Poe, "The City Beneath the Sea," which seemed just incredibly apt. And I hadn't been back after Katrina before, just the other day. I'm fumbling at expressing what I'm trying to express, but in some ways, the past is still present in a way that if you grew up in New York, which I did, everything, your past is erased, physically erased. The school I went to, the houses I lived in, all of them, they're all gone. Here, it's you can sort of see, it seems to me, the past over a lifetime. It's a very special quality and a very unusual one in the city. I don't know. It makes me feel sad. It makes me feel, as one will when one reacts to something beautiful. I think it's beautiful, and tragic, and moving, and joyful. And I have the sense of youth, of being young here, which was great. Yeah, however, impoverished a youth it was, and of seeing time pass over, like the sense of time passing over the place. I have that as well. So that's as far as I will sort of babble.
Well, Bob, let's go back to Hall of Mirrors, whose protagonist is this amazing character, Reinhardt. He's a drunk, a dopehead, a sort of cynical visionary, a one-time, once brilliant classical clarinetist. He's a right-wing radio announcer. He's in many ways a preposterous but always fascinating character. Where on earth did Reinhardt come from? Did you just conjure him up out of your imagination? Were there models? Is it a composite? I mean, what is the genesis of this?
Well, I was very taken at that time with of all things, right-wing radio. I mean, this is 50 years ago. 50 years ago, right-wing radio was alive and well. And the wandering disc jockey was a phenomenon at that time. People got, there were people who drift from city to city, sort of taking jobs on small-time radio stations or relatively big-time radio stations. I got approached by, I won't go into detail about this, but I got approached by a radio station here through the guy who was my landlord to do this kind of undercover thing for the radio station, which I wasn't about to do, but because I would have ended up in the river fast if I had tried to do this, and I knew my own relative limitations, one of which was that I wanted to go on living for a while. And so I found a little bit out about the radio here, and I'd known a little about it before because I'd done some sort of small-time broadcasting. Not a lot, I mean, it doesn't count, it's all kiddie stuff. But I just thought about the character, and I thought about, I wonder what would it be like to work for and be the voice of a political entity that you had absolutely no sympathy for at all, but that was a living. This was partly, I'd worked for the New York Daily News in New York, so I knew what it was like to work for people whose political perspective was a whole lot different from mine. And I got fascinated with the sort of right-wing radio. I mean, it's too bad I didn't write that novel now.
That was very prescient, wasn't it? I mean, because it wasn't the phenomenon then that it is now.
No, it was different. I mean, it was different, but it wasn't. It was the same. The lines were essentially the same, although they were drawn much more unreasonably, or what would seem today. I mean, they were defending segregation, right? I mean, nobody does that openly, by today. But otherwise, the spirit was the same. Yeah, it was, and this fascinated me. This is where I got the character from. A character, you live with a character for a while, and the character takes on a certain kind of reality. You live with a character the whole writing day, and they become a kind of alternative, alternative life for you, persona for you. I think almost all writers have in common, that history of being dreamy children who fantasized a lot and maybe spent a lot of time alone and dreamed up people. I mean, you start dreaming up people in the sense of writing fiction really when you're very small. You start inventing people, and you go on doing it, and that so. He came out of the ether, out of a couple of experiences. I had minor experiences, and I just sort of imagined my way into him.
What about his language, his voice? He apparently has a great resonant voice for the radio, but his speech, the voice of Reinhardt echoes through this whole book. Where did that come from? Is that coming from your mind's ear? Is it coming from echoes of people?
It's echoes of people. It's my mind's ear, but it's also, I went to acting school briefly when I got out of the service, and I remember, being taught how to project, how to enunciate, how to deal with lines. The method, it was the Berghoff School of Drama in New York. So it was all put together from bits and pieces, rags and bones.
Yeah. Could you give us a reading from Hall of Mirrors with this?
What I was going to read a little of, I won't go too far with it, is really about these these sort of proto-hippies who lived in the quarter.
Reinhardt and his buddies.
Reinhardt and his buddies, and this may be an early essay into trying to write a dialogue of people stoned. But I mean, the background here is Morgan Rainey is a Mississippian who finds himself maneuvered into a politician's scheme to sweep people, to expose welfare queens, as they came to be called. That whole concept of, people people being on welfare, and they're all actually really secretly very rich, but they, that whole hustle that existed.
Try to weed out the welfare
weed out
right?
the chiselers, weed out the welfare chiselers, which became a kind of right-wing rallying cry, and. Reinhardt works for this radio station, and his voice is on the air, introducing these various limbo type people. And Rainey goes to confront Reinhardt. Rainey, who is a sincere and local person who was in the Peace Corps in Venezuela, who is trying to do something.
He's a liberal.
Right. He's a liberal.
Social liberal.
He's a white Southern social liberal, and he wants to confront Reinhardt, who is this sort of drifter, and who lives down in the quarter with these people, with these other people, with his girlfriend and these sort of strange people. So Rainey goes to confront them, and he runs into these people who are all whacked out of their minds. And Rainey walked home from Artesian Street. As he climbed the patio stairs, he heard the Kyrie of the Berlioz's Requiem from Bogdanovich's apartment. He stopped and rapped on the screen door. From inside came the quick shuffle of concealment that usually answered his knock. In a moment, Bogdanovich came to the door and looked at him through the screen. Kyrie eleison, Bogdanovich said. Is Reinhardt here? Rainey asked. I'd like to ask him something. Bogdanovich opened the door and bowed him inside. Reinhardt was sitting on an orange sofa. Above him on the wall was a checkered nude by Gustav Klimt. The dark girl who lived with Bogdanovich sat cross-legged on a cedar chest. Their eyes were red and filmy. The apartment smelled of marijuana. Reinhardt got up and turned off the record player. What would you like to ask me? He inquired. Rainey looked uncomfortably about the apartment and sat down in a canvas chair. He folded his hands in his lap and fell at once into his interviewing manner. Now, he began. Who's out there? Called a voice from the bathroom. Somebody was splashing about the tub. Are they cool? It's the man upstairs, Marvin, Reinhardt said. Nobody would exactly call him cool, but I don't think he'll have us arrested. You won't have us arrested, will you, Mr. Rainey? I have nothing against marijuana, Rainey said. Down in Venezuela, they smoked it. Bogdanovich, Reinhardt, and the dark girl watched him with a curious satisfaction. He says he won't have us arrested, Reinhardt called to Marvin, because they smoke pot in Venezuela. I'll buy that, Marvin said. Reinhardt, Rainey said, there's a man named Calvin Minnow in the state's attorney's office. I think I heard him speak on your station once. Do you know him? Bogdanovich, who had been lighting a joint, passed it along to Reinhardt and began to laugh silently, holding his belly. Calvin Minnow, he exclaimed. Calvin Minnow. Sure, Reinhardt said, exhaling. Cal Minnow. He's a good cat. I remember him. He has a happy face. Do you know what he's doing to the people on welfare? I don't know anything, Reinhardt said. All I know is he has a happy face and he chews something for his breath. He has a plan to throw half the people on state relief off the rolls. He's going to do it to get his name talked about. Yeah, Reinhardt said, they all got plans. Everybody has a plan. It's pretty weird. What other plans do these people have, Reinhardt? What's going on? Wait a minute, the dark girl said. I thought we were going to talk about Venezuela. Mr. Rainey, Reinhardt said, I am not the one who knows the plans. I can only assure you that for myself, I have no plans of any sort whatsoever at all. I've never been to Venezuela, Bogdanovich said, but I have a very clear picture of it in my mind. I mean, I'm not trying to compromise you, Rainey said. It's just that you're the only person I know who has any contact with this business. You're the only person I can ask. I would hate Reinhardt to be the only person I could ask, the dark girl said. I don't know quite why. Rainey sat frowning and watched them pass, the resinous joint between them. Back in the bathroom, Marvin began to sing, Sailing to Venezuela. I can't understand you, Reinhardt. I keep hearing your voice over the radio. I hear it all the time from back where I work. What do you get from them? Why do you work there, of all places? You could do other things. That's right, the dark girl said. You have to admit that, Reinhardt. How come you work for these degenerate creeps? My employers are not degenerate creeps, Reinhardt said. They are some of the finest people in our community. It's true that they're terrible when aroused. Man, the girl said, they're terrible all the time. They're subhuman cruds. You talk like an extremist, Reinhardt said. You're not seeing the big picture. Rainey isn't the only one here who's been seized with melancholy introspection. Speaking as a broadcaster, it's my opinion that there is a deep confusion in the popular heart and mind. The pop heart and mind demand assurance. Unusual times demand unusual hustles. The explanation number is very big. He drew his toke and passed the joint with a shrug. Trust me. Trust your Reinhardt. Don't be a degenerate creep, the girl told him. My conscience is clear, Reinhardt said. It's bone dry. I'll stop at that point. Right. Thank you.